For decades, the history of the DC Universe has been marked by its crisis-level events, status quo-altering storylines that have rewritten continuity while also providing a meta-commentary on DC Comics publishing itself, and all under a signature red glow. This is Red Skies, a 13-part podcast epic mining these events and the Superman of it all. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Red Skies, Chapter 10. Joining me to discuss Dark Knight's Metal, as well as the first half of Scott Snyder's Justice League run, is the host of Truth, Justice, and Hope, a Superman podcast, returning guest Grant Richter. Welcome back.
Hey, Anthony, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about part of what we covered tonight.
Well, that makes one of us. This will be an interesting one. I have a bit to say. We'll try to keep it positive. We'll try to keep it friendly and diplomatic. But this was a little bit of a rough go for me, I won't lie, going through the material. And this was all the first time for me. And we'll get to all of that. Let me toss it to you first. So just big picture. We'll unpack everything as we always do. But just big picture, what has your relationship been with the Metal event and the portion of, or even the entirety of the Scott Snyder Justice League run up until this point?
I read them for the first time in 2021. My thoughts on Metal and Death Metal are, I have an appreciation for what they are, and I'll get into that. I don't love them. I think No Justice is okay. I love this Justice League run. I read it every year since I've read it the first time. My daughter's read it. I forced it on her. She's like, okay, fine. But I love this Justice League run.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And I'll explain why when we get into it. Maybe I can change your mind on it.
Maybe. Look, one of the things that has come up time and again over the course of doing this podcast is that this is a journey and a man can have a change of heart. And I've covered certain things multiple times on this podcast and have had very different opinions between episodes. So most recently with Final Crisis, where I totally came around on that. And now I count myself as a major fan of that, whereas previously it was really something I struggled with. So I always keep an open mind, and who knows, maybe we'll have a Metal redo down the line. I don't think so, but you never know. So I'm open to that, and I'm definitely happy to get your perspective. And it may very well be the case. You might share some insight that sort of colors my perspective differently, and I might come around on it. So I'm totally open to that. In terms of what we read, so we looked at the core Dark Knight's Metal miniseries, the 6-issue miniseries by Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo. We also looked at or at least in terms of what I read, I looked at the 2 issues that led into it, the Forge and the casting. And there were a couple of Snyder written one-shots, specifically Batman Lost and the Wild Hunt, that I took a look at as well. Like you said, we looked at the 4-issue No Justice miniseries that immediately followed Metal and was a bridge to the next piece that we read, which was Scott Snyder's Justice League run. Now, he ended up doing a 39-issue run. We'll get to the second half in a later episode, but specifically you and I looked at the first 18 issues collected over 3 trades. So it's funny because I was texting a couple of friends of mine earlier, and I laid out everything that we had read for this, and as I was typing it all out, I was like, that was a lot. So I thank you for doing all of the homework.
Part of it was easy because I'm in the middle of covering Metal on my show right now. So I'm like, oh, yeah, I've already got that. But the rest, I am, like I said, No Justice is kind of my least favorite. But, that Justice League run, it's a joy for me to read. So that was no work at all.
It's been, again, a journey overall, going through everything for this podcast, but especially these crisis events over the course of Red Skies. And I've really been in a great groove. And there are things that I've been revisiting, things like 52 that I've been reading for the first time and having a great time and really, really enjoying myself. And again, hit a little bit of a wall here, but I think there are some specific reasons that I can point to as to why. So we'll get into that. And I also know that you're a huge fan of the Rebirth era and this event is during that time. Although,
Right.
and maybe this is something we could touch on in this episode. It'll probably come up a little bit over our next couple of episodes when we cover Doomsday Clock and then death metal. But I know there was a little bit of a discrepancy, a little bit of a divide, some questions about how Doomsday Clock, which was building out of what Jeff Johns started with that Rebirth special, and these metal
Hmm.
events, how, if at all, they fit together. Right? I know that was a conversation at the time.
Yeah, I don't know that they really fit together at all. In fact, even beyond the Rebirth one shot, Jurgens builds a lot on the idea of Doctor Manhattan coming back in his run on Action Comics. Metal just comes out of nowhere and just slams into continuity in a way that I kind of enjoy, but it's like I don't enjoy reading metal or death metal, but I like what they represent. And like I said, I'll talk more about that when we get into it specifically. As a fan of the metal genre myself, but it's reading metal and death metal are kind of a slog for me. So,
Interestingly, I was going to ask if you are a fan of metal, heavy metal music generally,
oh yes, I
yeah,
have been since 1990. I've got metal albums going all the way back to the early 80s. Starting with Dio's Holy Diver, which this series reminds me a lot of, and I think that's kind of why I kind of sort of like it. But yeah, I'm a big metalhead.
no, that's great, and I'm sure that gives you a different perspective. It's for me that music. I don't have anything against it, and there are moments I think about them. The last season of Stranger Things, for example, where music like that I think
Yes.
could be used really effectively and really cool, and I'm
Hmm.
there for it. But as far as what I would just be listening to on a daily basis, it's not that. It just doesn't really speak to me. I mean, I like
Right.
Matchbox 20 and Gavin DeGraw and Ed Sheeran. It's a very vanilla as far as
Sure.
the musical tastes go. So the whole metal aspect of this doesn't really
Hmm.
do much for me in and of itself, but I can appreciate it. But I wanted to ask because again, as such a fan of this rebirth era, and I know that's what you focus your podcast on, that
Yeah.
period of time specifically in the Superman books. Yeah, I guess maybe you already answered this, but do you consider the metal events and metal in particular of a piece with that rebirth era or really kind of in its own pocket?
It's definitely in some pocket. It really has nothing to do with what's going on. And I think the same can be applied to the Bendis era. This Justice League series, it is completely sideways of what Bendis is doing, for which I'm grateful because I am not a fan of the Bendis era. So when I get past Action 1000 on my podcast, I'm going to be doing the opposite of what I'm doing now, is where I'm barely talking about Justice League and focusing on Superman and Action Comics. I'm going to do just the opposite. I'm going to focus almost entirely on Justice League and just kind of mention what Bendis is doing over here on the side. It's Snyder is really doing his own thing on your Final Crisis episode, which I really liked, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
um, San Gregorio was talking about how, you know, or maybe it was one of you two said it. Morrison just kind of doesn't really pay attention to what other writers are doing with continuity, and there was some comparison between Morrison and Snyder, um, in the fact that sometimes when I read their work, I don't know what's going on. Um, but yeah, Snyder does the same thing. He's like, well, I've been building up to this since issue one of New 52 Batman, and I'm just going to do it no matter what else is going on in continuity at the time. And I think the smart thing he did with Metal and Death Metal, I think Justice League is a story he wanted to tell. And I think Metal's what sets it up, and Death Metal's what takes it back to the status quo. And if it wasn't for that, it would completely just demolish everything in DC continuity at the time. But he does keep it relatively self-contained.
Speaking of Snyder, did you read slash are you a fan of his Batman run that preceded this?
I want to read more of it than I have. I've read like the first arc, the Court of Owls arc. I was really into it when it first came out. And I went through I just happened to go through a Batman phase right as that was coming out, and I was eating it up. And like with most things, with most superhero phases with me, I kind of fell off pretty quickly. But I do like his Batman run from what I've read of it so far. I
Gotcha.
want to go back and kind of fill in the blanks and like, well, this obviously had, this happened in like All Star Batman, and this happened in the main Batman series. I want to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, I can totally appreciate the long game that he was playing. I've only ever read the beginning part of his Batman work. So I read actually the detective run that he did before the New 52. Black
Cool.
Mirror was the, at least that's how it was collected. And it was a great
Mm,
story. I really enjoyed it. And this was when he was just starting out, up and comer. And then
right.
I did read, I guess, the Court of Owls arc from the New 52 run, and really enjoyed it and always intended to continue and finish the run. But with a lot of things, I just kind of got sidetracked and I wasn't as dialed in, and I just never went back to it. So, yeah, I mean, in fairness, I've only read a piece of the Batman run, but again, like I said, I appreciate this long game that he was playing. I guess let me lay this out here because I don't want to come in too hot and I don't want to be hostile and I want to keep it friendly. And here's the thing with Scott Snyder. So I've never met him. Seems like a cool guy. I know he's been very open with fans about his mental health journey, which I very much admire. And reading Metal, reading his Justice League run, clearly this is someone with deep love and appreciation for DC Comics, the DCU, DC continuity. He talked in interviews about rereading past DC events in preparation for this, and it shows clearly this is a guy heavily influenced by Grant Morrison. And there is something to be said for playing with all of these toys that Morrison created. There's value in that, right? Morrison introduced a lot of ideas that get brought back here, that get expanded and taken in different directions. There's something to be said for that. And you also get the sense, while I don't know behind the scenes if there were any restrictions, any bounds within which Snyder had to stay, I get the sense that he had relatively free reign with these stories. They certainly read that way. They read like someone getting to tell exactly the story that they wanted to tell. And I
Hmm.
will always admire and appreciate that. And hats off to him for being able to do that. Right. I think for me, it just wasn't for me. And I can pinpoint why. And I'll also look, as I always say, the disclaimer I always issue for people who love this event, whether we're talking Metal or the Justice League run like yourself, for people who enjoy this work to any degree, awesome. Love it. Keep loving it. Maybe at some point I'll join you in the sun. But for me, I just felt reading Metal, reading Justice League, it just felt exhausting. It felt like the work was wholly devoted to the architecture of world building and tying together every conceivable thread that could be tied together across the DC universe. And
Hmm.
again, I can certainly see someone reading this and saying, hey, that's cool. Right. So I think mileage will vary. For me, again, I just found it exhausting because for me, I didn't find the emotional grounding that I needed to. And we'll talk about the ways in which Snyder is clearly influenced by Morrison. And we've talked on the show at length just a couple of episodes ago about how dense and intricate and complex and sometimes inscrutable Morrison's work can be. But what I've found now over time, over years, over these rereads and these conversations is that there's a payoff. I found that when I really wrestle with Morrison's work, I'm getting something out of it. And there's always some emotional core that I'm able to tap into that resonates with me. And as much as I tried with this work, and I'm not saying there's absolutely nothing there, that it's all plot, but it's a lot of plot and it's dense. And if I could tell you the amount of times, I can't say flipping the page because I was reading on my iPad, but the number of times I tapped my iPad screen and it scrolled over to reveal a double page spread with like wall to wall exposition, I was pulling my hair out. So I
Hmm.
found this to be again a bit of a struggle to get through, but for me I think it just wasn't my cup of tea. So that's kind of where I landed on that. But I'm glad to hear, at least with respect to the Justice League run, if not Metal itself, that it you got more out of it than I did.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was talking about off mic, um, I don't necessarily see the relationship to Morrison as far as writing style and things like that. But when it comes to really not understanding always what they're talking about, I'm definitely there as far as metal goes and as far as death metal goes. I am a big fan of the metal genre, and metal feels like a both parody of and love letter to the metal genre because it's very frenetic and it's a lot going on and it's just in your face constantly. And I'm not necessarily sure what just happened. Like when as I'm reading the Justice League arc and as I'm reading No Justice, it's referencing the big thing that happens at the end of Metal, and I'm like, did that happen? Wait, when did that happen? Oh, it happened on one panel on almost the like the last page of the finale of the episode before it goes into the epilogue. Um, and it's like you said, a lot of elements that ties in all of this stuff that Snyder was doing going back at least to the beginning of his New 52 run with the Court of Owls and the metal that they used to bring their talons back to life, and stuff that he was doing later in his Batman run with the Lazarus pits and whatever kind of metals involved in that, and just everything and everything and everything and everything. And reading it, looking at it, and reading the pace of it, it's like listening to like Master of Puppets. It's really fast. It's really loud. It's fun, but I don't like it. I think the story's fun. I don't necessarily like metal, the Dark Knight's metal in and of itself. I think some of the concepts are cool. Like the Dark Knights are cool. The Dark Multiverse feels like the Upside Down from Stranger Things. I don't know which one came out first. I think Stranger Things came out first. But the Batman Who Laughs gets way overused from the beginning of Metal to the end of Death Metal. Way too much Batman Who Laughs. But he's a neat visual. He's a neat concept. The Devastator, all the different Dark Knights, they're really interesting concepts. But I can do without reading metal and death metal. I honestly think the Justice League run was the story he wants to tell. It feels like, because a lot of people complain that too much story is compressed into a 6 or 7 issue miniseries because you've got to get it out in this amount of time. The Justice League run feels like a decompressed event. It's like he had 2 years to tell an event story and he spaced it out, and it has room to breathe. And metal feels like the setup to it. Death metal feels like the return to status quo. And what comes between those two bookends is really the story he wanted to tell, in my opinion.
No, that's fair. And I know, I feel like if in an ideal scenario for you, I would have just asked you to do the Justice League run, and I appreciate you. I appreciate you
That's
doing
okay.
metal. It's funny
Like I'm
because
I'm doing metal on my show right now, so I'm waist deep in it. So I'm like, okay, I'm just kind of checking my notes over here, and okay, good, I'm good to go.
so you're in it. Well, I'm glad that I'm glad the timing lined up. But it's funny because I knew I wanted to cover Snyder's Justice League run at some point. Again, everything we're talking about in this episode and when we get to our death metal episode in 2 weeks, all new for me. But I had read about it and I knew that Snyder did a lot with Lex in particular. So I knew I wanted
Mhm.
to cover it at some point. Obviously, I was aware of the whole Legion of Doom aspect, having covered Super Friends not too long ago. I kind of had an idea at one point. I said, oh, maybe I would kind of go back to the Snyder run in conjunction with further Super Friends coverage. But then I kind of did what I needed to do on the Super Friends front. And honestly, having read what I've read so far of the of the Justice League run, I mean, other than it being the Legion of Doom, I really do not see this as a kindred spirit of the Super Friends cartoon. I think this
Right.
is where it fits better in terms of coverage. But
Hmm.
here's the thing: with Morrison, I readily admit, and I know a lot of fans feel this way. There have been times where I've read Morrison's work and have felt like, man, I don't really get what they're going for. I don't really know what
Hmm.
the takeaway is supposed to be here. To be honest, I'm sure there are aspects of Metal and the Justice League run that maybe went over my head, or I didn't fully get every nuance of it. But it wasn't so much. This is the thing. It wasn't so much that I felt like, oh, I don't know what just happened. It was more that it was again, just kind of relentless. And to your
Yes.
point though, and I put this up on Twitter or X last night, where maybe that's the point, right? It is this kind of this barrage, this cacophony of events and everything that are being thrown at you. And if that's the intention to really create, I don't know, like you're in a club and like the music is just like
Yeah.
pounding and like pulsating and it's just like washing over you. It does that. I mean, again, like I said, for me, it's not necessarily what I want out of my reading experience, but if that's the intention, they nailed it. They really
Mhm.
did. But yeah, for me,
Yeah,
it wasn't so much,
it
oh,
is.
I don't really get what happened here. It was more that again, like I said, I just kind of found it exhausting. I do also, you mentioned San Gregorio from our Final Crisis episode, and I mentioned texting with some buddies. I got to give a shout out to Mike San Gregorio and Ralph Puma, two prior guests of the show, because we have a running text chain, and I was texting them over the course of this reading, and the texts are really not for public consumption, but it was very helpful just to sort of vent and also ask them a ton of questions. One of which was, I said to Ralph in particular, because not only is he a huge Morrison fan and he's read metal, but he's also studied the occult. So he actually is immersed in the lore that gave birth to a lot of this. And I
Mhm.
said to him, how do you pronounce the name of the bat god that rules the dark universe that is so prevalent in metal? And you and I were talking off mic. I said, how do you pronounce it? So let me ask you now, before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of what's going on in this story, what is your pronunciation of the dark god?
No, I should say that my pronunciation is colored by another podcast. Before I was even reading this, I listened to another podcast called Dr. DC, and they were talking about it as it was being built up, and they pronounced it Barbatos, which makes sense to me because everything in metal is a bat pun, and even more so in death metal. But what was the alternate take?
What and I'm not pinning all of this on Ralph. It's it's but what he recommended was Barbatos.
Mhm.
Barbatos. Now, again, I think this is open to interpretation. So yeah, I'm sure you'll hear this pronounced in different ways. And even in this episode, Grant and I are going to pronounce it in different ways. So it's all
Right.
right. But in case anyone hasn't read metal, and it's possible that they haven't, and especially it's not that old. It's really only a few
Mhm.
years old. So it's possible that people might have kind of missed the boat on it. And maybe our discussion is their first exposure to it. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry if that's the case. But it was 2017, 2018, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was late, it
Mhm.
started in fall of 2017. And the long and short of it is Batman's investigation into the metal in the various metals in the DC universe leads him to the discovery of this dark multiverse underneath our multiverse that is home to Barbatos or Barbatos or however you want to say it, this dark bat god that seeks to bring down our multiverse into the darkness and is populated by these dark inversions, dark Batman themed versions of our familiar characters. So this is a Batman centric cosmic event, which you might not expect to see something like that, but here you go.
Yeah, that when I first heard about this, that was such a turn off to me because I am not the biggest Batman fan. I It takes a lot for me to get on board with a Batman book, and like, oh God, it's a supernatural cosmic event that revolves around Batman, who has the secret superpower of the universe making him look cool. So I was like, man, I don't know. But I jumped on it like when I started just consuming everything that Superman was in a few years ago. I'm like, okay, it's on the path. Let's read it. And honestly, Superman does not come out great in metal. He gets duped a lot. And I don't love that. But yeah, just that much Batman in one event is a lot of Batman.
It is. It is. It's funny because last week we covered Flashpoint and Flashpoint Beyond, but it's funny. Because where I'm going with this is Flashpoint. Obviously, is a very Flash centric event. It
Mhm.
totally made sense though in the context of that story and the rewriting of the timeline. It totally
Yes.
fit as a Flash event. But just kind of taking a larger look at these events generally, if there is one character who they tend to be built around, or at least feature prominently. Superman is at the heart of a lot of these, thankfully
Yeah.
for us. Again,
Goodness. Yeah.
Flashpoint was definitely an exception. You know, Zero
Yeah.
Hour as well. Flashpoint Beyond certainly again became more of a Batman story. But yeah, with this, it's very much a Batman story to an extent, I suppose, but not in a way that feels like a natural fit, like Flashpoint.
Yeah.
Right? I feel like this was a little bit more of a stretch. So, again, I said before that for me, I found what I found lacking was really kind of this emotional grounding or this emotional core, something that really resonated with me throughout the
Mhm.
event. And I guess the way it's been described, reading some of the interviews that Snyder gave and whatnot, is the heroes have to face the dark versions of themselves, the darkness within. And sure, sure, but I feel like that that plays out more literally than figuratively than emotionally. In fairness, I did not read all of the one shots. I know they did a number of them that spotlighted the other Dark Knights, the Batman
Mhm.
themed inversions of the Justice League characters. Like just as an example, and I'm sure you know more about this than I do. The Devastator, for example, is the Bruce Wayne of Earth -22, I think, who infused himself with the Doomsday virus to take down the Superman of his world who went bad. Is that the idea?
Yeah. Yes.
And then so he became
Absolutely.
this like doomsday monster. So
Yeah.
the Devastator Dark Knight is again this doomsday infused Bruce Wayne of Earth -22, just as an example
Right.
for people. And there are similar counterparts for Flash and Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and so on. But yeah, I guess my question is again because maybe I'm being too harsh, and I really, I keep an open mind. I want to check myself. Did you find in terms of that emotionality? Did you find something there that maybe I kind of glossed over, or just I didn't grab onto? Was there something that really worked for you?
The thing that fell flat with the Dark Knights for me is because the whole thing, especially with the Batman Who Laughs, is that Batman can beat anybody. And if you combine, Batman or the Batmen of these different dark universes, they were all smarter than the Justice League members of those, the Batman of the Earth of the Drowned, or the Batwoman of the Earth of the Drowned is smarter than Aquaman, and the Batman of the Earth of uh, Light Dawnbreaker is smarter than the Green Lantern of that Earth, and so forth and so on. But then when they come to Earth Zero, they're honestly, a lot of them get their butts handed to them pretty handily, especially like Dawnbreaker. Um, the Devastator is hard to take down because he can infect anyone around him with the Doomsday virus. But there, there seemed to be more of an element of telling and not showing with the different Dark Knights, except for in their one shots. So like this is how cool they are on their universe, but it's almost like when you take them out of their element, out of their core universe, then they're really honestly not that impressive other than as a visual and against like civilians.
Gotcha, gotcha. The other thing too, when I say because I want to give examples of what I'm talking about. When I say that I felt that the work was more concerned with world building than anything else. An example from Dark Knight's Metal #3, when Bruce has been taken to the dark multiverse and Clark decides he's going to go get him, which is kind of like the main thing he does in this event is like he goes to the
Right.
multiverse to get Bruce, which I loved that was so devoted to his friend. Everyone else is scattering to find what remains of nth metal on our Earth, but Clark has decided, right, he's going to go to the dark multiverse to rescue Bruce. I like that. That's like the main thing he does in this. And that's the other thing too. Look, as Superman fans and Superman podcasters, we're always looking for the Superman of it all. And
Mhm.
in some of these events that we're talking about, there's not a lot to be had there. Thankfully, those are the exceptions. And whoa,
Right.
wait till we get to Doomsday Clock next week. We'll have a field
Mhm.
day. But in any event, when he needs to get to the dark multiverse, Clark and Flash and Steel use the Phantom Zone projector, the Anti Monitor's antenna, the nth metal in Steel's suit, and the Speed Force to
Mhm.
create this portal essentially to the dark multiverse. Because
Yes.
what Clark realizes when he sees the coordinates of the dark multiverse is that they're pretty close actually to the
Mhm.
Phantom Zone. And Barry theorizes, oh, the Phantom Zone is a permeable membrane to the dark multiverse. So again, it's this
Hmm.
combination of the Anti-Monitor from Crisis on Infinite Earths, guys. His antenna, Steel's armor, the Speed Force, the Phantom Zone, that gets you to the multiverse.
Yeah.
And that there's so many instances of stuff like that. And again, I could totally see someone having the complete opposite reaction as I did. Someone might be like, oh, "That's great! Like you're tying all of this stuff together." That in and of itself, I didn't mind so much. So maybe that's not the best example, but there were just so many instances of things like that where we are kind of connecting these dots that maybe don't always need to be connected. And we'll get into this deeper when we get into the Martian Manhunter and Lex of it all, of the Justice League
Hmm.
run. And you might feel totally differently than I do on this, but that's the thing when we talk about this world building. And I know especially in the fantasy space, world building is a
Hmm.
huge thing, and I get it. But I suppose it just wasn't what I was looking for in this story. And after a while, it just felt kind of like I don't care anymore.
Right. Yeah, the whole, Speed Force plus anti-monitor antenna plus Steel's armor plus Phantom Zone. That on my podcast was the example of that I put out as the most nonsensical thing in it, but it's done with such enthusiasm and apparent love that I couldn't help not enjoying it at the moment. Um, it's like Snyder's going, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this plus this plus this plus this equals this happened. It's like, okay, man, calm down.
Yeah.
It's like it's like Snyder was drinking 3 pots of coffee and listening to Master of Puppets on repeat the whole time he was writing this, and I get it. It's fast and it's loud, and it's loud for a visual medium, and it's fun, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think this is where the comparison to Morrison does come into play. It doesn't necessarily have to make sense for different reasons than what Morrison does. Morrison's coming at it from, I'm trying to make you see the bigger picture of stories and how we fit into the universe and all that stuff. And Morrison's going, hot damn, this is fun. So I'm not Morrison, Snyder. Um, so it's a bizarre read. There are lots of nonsense things that happen in this. You know, a, the Justice League Voltron Megazord in the first issue, I still can't decide if I like that or not because it's so stupid, but it's so entertaining. Um, Batman riding a Velociraptor, Batman using Baby Darkseid as a weapon to stop Superman and Wonder Woman from him messing with his investigation. It's and we talked about this off mic. There was an Adult Swim show back in the early 2010s called Metalocalypse, and it's a love letter and parody of the metal genre. And this is really what it feels like. It's like, this is stupid and this is ridiculous, but dang, it's epic, and isn't it fun? Doing it's like doing a line of coke and watching Sharknado. It's insane, but there's something kind of entertaining about it. And the ridiculousness almost makes it, if it wasn't so ridiculous, I wouldn't like it at all. But it's the fact that it is so over the top is what makes it kind of work for
Oh,
me.
interesting. That's fair. I do get that. I also recognize that all of the issues that I laid out, I read these over for the first time over a span of really just a few nights,
Hmm.
not no more than a week, and we've been having construction done at our house, and we're getting ready for our son's birthday party, and work has been a little bit on the busier side recently. So there is the personal component as well where I don't, and I wonder that it's like I don't know that I was totally in the right headspace as I was reading these. Right, it's at night. I'm tired, and
Hmm.
this was kind of the the last thing that I was looking for at that particular moment. At the same time, I know myself pretty well, and I've been doing this a while now, so I feel relatively confident in saying that even totally fresh, I would still probably feel the same.
I
But
get it.
but it's
Absolutely. I
fine.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like I said, if if Snyder played this completely straight, if it was like, this thing happens, and here's a logical reason for it to happen, and then this next thing happens, and there's a logical reason for this, and it's, completely by the books, I would not like this at all because it is nonsense. But because it is so frenetic and it's it goes intentionally over the top in the way a lot of metal music does. This is speed metal. This is power metal. It's not death metal because that's death metal absolutely all the way. But it's thrash metal. It's taking everything to the 11th degree and just asking you to hold on and just try not to get an arm chopped off.
It's funny. For a long time, especially at my old comic shop, a couple of us used to say this about Morrison. We would say, to really get and enjoy Morrison's work, you need to be on whatever, you need to be reading it on whatever drugs they were on writing it.
Yeah.
And I've abandoned that. I don't feel that way anymore. But I get it. I mean, I think, yeah, maybe there is a certain vibe, there is a certain headspace that you need to
Hmm.
be in. So, just a random tangent here. So, I'm a huge How I Met Your Mother fan. There's an episode from the first season, Okay, Awesome, it's called, where they go clubbing. And it's been so many years now. I think it's Lily. I feel like it's Lily who's saying to them, like, you guys really want to do this? You go to the club, and, like, the music's pounding. It's like douche, 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 douche. And I kept thinking about that as I was reading that scene from How I Met Your Mother, because that's what it felt like. We keep talking about Morrison, and I think in terms of those big, wild ideas and the cosmic landscape that is utilized, I think there's definitely similarities for sure. And then
Hmm.
more specifically, there are specific threads that Morrison set up, particularly in Final Crisis and The Return of Bruce Wayne. Now,
Hmm.
have you read The Return of Bruce Wayne and Morrison's larger Batman work at all?
I've read the introduction to Damian Wayne. I'm in the middle of reading R.I.P. right now. I've read Final Crisis. I've read his run of Batman when Dick Grayson had the cowl, but I've not read The Return and all that stuff.
Okay, you definitely need to read The Return of Bruce Wayne. I think you'll enjoy it, but it definitely ties in very directly. And in fact, in the one of the metal collections, I forget what it's called, maybe Metal Rising or something, where it collects a lot of the prologue material. It collects the forge and the casting. It
Hmm.
also includes the last two issues of Final Crisis and the first issue of Return of Bruce Wayne, which is like
Oh wow.
fine. It's fine. But I'm saying to myself, if you haven't read Final Crisis in its entirety, like let's say you're a newer fan to DC and you're excited about metal, whatever, for whatever reason it catches your eye, and you pick up this prologue trade paperback and they throw the 6th and 7th issues of Final Crisis at you, like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
That made me laugh. But we just covered Final Crisis, and at the end of that, Batman is hit by the Omega sanction and seemingly is killed. But of course, as we find out in the closing pages, he was transported back to the dawn of man. So the
Hmm.
return of Bruce Wayne tracks his return to the present day, and so you see him across the eras of the DC universe. But specifically, Darkseid also sent back with him the so-called hyper adapter, which is a weaponized thought. Again, thank you to Mike San Gregorio for laying so much of this out. But this weaponized thought that's kind of like attacking him through time.
Hmm.
And in the first issue, during that period, the dawn of man, that's where we see Bruce Wayne don the bat cloak that Snyder picks up that thread that we have now. Originally, there were three tribes of man, right? The bear, the wolf, the hawk, right, and now also
Yeah.
the bat,
Yeah. The Traitor Tribe. Yeah.
right. And so, in the Return of Bruce Wayne, there's a moment where Bruce is captured and about to be killed, and he has this vision of a bat god. And whether or not in the pages of the Return of Bruce Wayne, whether or not that was literally Barbatos or it was just the hyper adapter, kind of open to
Hmm.
interpretation, we think. But there are later points in the story where you see the acolytes of this dark god try to bring him back, and what they bring forth is rather just the hyper adapter. It's not the dark god himself. In any event, this idea of this dark bat god out there was a big part of the return of Bruce Wayne, and certainly that first issue. And again, is clearly clearly made an impression on Snyder here, and he really ran with it and developed this entire lore about the Dark Multiverse.
Yeah, that does make sense. I did not know all that. I knew some of the broad strokes of the Return of Bruce Wayne, and when you're reading like the Forge and the casting, it does reference some of that stuff. I'm like, oh yeah, I recognize that from cultural osmosis. But yeah, I've never read that. I do need to read that. My goal is to read as much mainstream DC stuff as possible. A lot of their creator-owned stuff is just so far over my head that I don't even try. But yeah, I like Morrison. I want to like Morrison more than I do, but yeah, I need to get on that.
I've been there. Well, I've been there very
Mhm.
recently, so I get it.
Yeah.
I totally get it. But no, I think that if nothing else, at least read that, because I think that certainly really ties in here. And so,
I'll tell you what makes me feel stupid is my daughter, who is now 12, started reading comics when she was like 11. She started reading Morrison. She started with JLA. She loves Morrison. She understands Morrison. She said, "Can I read Final Crisis?" I'm like, "You can, but it's not going to make a lot of sense to you." And finally, after she read every other event so far, she's like, "The only event I haven't read since Crisis on Infinite Earths is Final Crisis. I want to read it." I'm like, "Okay." She read the whole thing. She was like, "Yeah, it made sense to me." Okay, love
excellent.
you.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that's great. Maybe there's something to be said for just kind of, I don't know, maybe for us as adults reading some of this
Mhm.
stuff, whatever baggage or expectations we bring to it, maybe it's limiting. And if you can kind of go in with more of that kind of like childlike wonder and openness,
I
maybe that is
guess.
the key.
I think
Maybe
she's
that
just
is the
smarter
key.
than me too.
But this actually kind of brings up an interesting question because and I'm wrestling with this because with the idea of this bat god, it just even just that, right? Uh, Morrison introduces this idea, and then Snyder runs with it and develops this whole lore. Kind of on this note, one of the things I was kind of like not looking forward to about doing this episode was, I want to give people context for what we're talking about. But at the same time, there's so much plot here. And I'm saying to myself, I don't
Mhm.
want to sit here for a half hour kind of explaining this because I feel like I'm going to drive myself crazy. But over the course of this event, again, we learn about this dark multiverse under ours, ruled by this dark god. We get the further lore that in the beginning there was matter and antimatter, and also dark matter, and there was this in this darkness this master forger who was forging worlds out of this mystical metal, for lack of a better term, and the worlds that made it rose to the orrery of worlds that we talked about and we saw in Final Crisis. But then the ones that didn't make it kind of sunk back down, and there was this dragon who consumed these worlds. But this
Mhm.
dragon eventually had enough of that and took out the forger and became Barbatos, this bat god. And I don't know exactly where this fits in terms of the time. I guess that all happened first. And then at some point has this interaction with Bruce Wayne at the dawn of time and sees Bruce as his vessel, the
Mhm.
wagon through which he will enter our world and then sink the multiverse down. Spoiler alert, by the time we get to the end of Metal, the heroes have prevailed with the help of 10th Metal that gives them this cool, shiny armor,
Right.
and they're able to join hands and connect not just with each other, but everyone across the universe. And they're able to lift the multiverse back up where it belongs. But inadvertently, they crack the source wall, and that leads us into the Justice League run. But even
Mhm.
before the Justice League run, cracking the source wall wakes up the Omega Titans, these
Mhm.
four cosmic beings that are going to come on and feast on the world. We could talk more
Yeah.
specifically about the various energies that they represent. And also within the source wall, what's freed is this totality that makes its way to Earth that houses this being Perpetua that was the originator of the previous multiverse. Again,
It's a lot.
there's more to unpack, but even just that gives you a sense kind of what we're
It
talking about.
it's Tolkien-esque in its scope. It's a lot.
Yes, with nary a moment to breathe. There are a
Yes.
few fun character beats. There are a few fun character
Mhm.
beats, especially when we get into Justice League, where they're all imitating Batman's voice. I don't know how much that felt I don't know how much that really felt like the characters to me, but it was fun, and I'm not going to begrudge the story. That I'll go with it. And like you said, at the beginning of Metal, when they're on Warworld with Mongol, they form the equivalent of a Megazord. As
Mm-hmm.
someone who just completed a Power Rangers podcast, I was happy. It was over the top and it was silly, but it was fun. I was on board with it. I'm not saying like I hated everything here. Anyway, going back to where I was starting with this, and this is the question I want to ask you because I'm wrestling with this. So Morrison introduces this idea of this dark bat god, and then
Mm-hmm.
Snyder runs with it and creates this whole lore. I don't know. On the one hand, it's like, well, how can I fault Snyder, right? Isn't the whole idea of this, right? We're not talking about self-contained creator-owned works here, right? Where someone tells a story and then they're done and everything gets put away and that's the end of it. We're in
Yeah.
this shared, ongoing, infinite comic book universe. And
Mm-hmm.
all of the stories that we're talking about, in fairness, right? Crisis on Infinite Earths, you have Marv Wolfman, who grew up reading all of these pre-Crisis team-ups, and now he tells Crisis on Infinite Earths. Jeff Johns, so clearly influenced by the original Crisis, he does the sequel with Infinite Crisis. Even more, here's the thing, even Morrison, so heavily influenced by Jack Kirby's Fourth World. So they're
Mm-hmm.
all building on what the other had done. So on the one hand, how can I fault Snyder for any of this? Good on him for
Right.
actually doing something with these ideas. But
Mm-hmm.
then at the same time, again, I think it was just, I guess it didn't bother me so much that in and of itself. It was just that it was too much at some point, I suppose.
I
I don't know
think
what my
where that
question is, but
where
wherever you want to go with that.
I think where his, if this is a love letter to Morrison, it's too soon. Like Crisis on Infinite Earths was built upon largely Silver Age stories. Infinite Crisis was built on, Crisis itself, which was 20 years prior. Final Crisis built on stuff from this early 70s. Um, Metal is built on something 10 years prior. It's too soon. It's too soon to be an homage or a love letter to, or whatever you want to call it.
That's a great point. And I kind of on that note, now as we're entering the final episodes of our event here, I feel like we've entered the phase of the snake eating its own tail or whatever you want to call it. Because I
Right.
feel like, yeah, but from Crisis to Infinite Crisis, there so much time had passed to have a direct sequel felt appropriate on the 20th anniversary. With
Mm-hmm.
Final Crisis, even though that was so close to Infinite Crisis, Morrison was doing his own thing, their own thing.
Yeah.
And again, in terms of playing off of those, fourth world ideas, so much time had passed there. So again, your point is a great one. In this era where we are now, you have Snyder playing off of these ideas introduced so recently, right? So I agree. It feels so soon. Next week when we talk about Doomsday Clock and more about Rebirth generally, even though I'm overall a fan, the one thing that's always kind of bugged me about that is like I know Flashpoint became I think more than what John's originally intended as far as actually launching the new 52. And we
Mm-hmm.
talked about that in our last episode. But it's like you have the architect of the story that led to one sort of reboot, then quote unquote fixing it. But it's like you were the one who did, you were the
Right.
one who did this
This
in
was
the
your
first place.
story. Yeah.
It's your story. Yeah, so I don't know. I feel like now we're in this kind of weird phase, and there. We talked about this last week. The whole business about the divine continuum from Flashpoint Beyond. Doomsday Clock is going to talk about the metaverse. This story introduces the dark multiverse. I just feel like now we're getting into these stories where we're talking about the nature of these stories and
Mm-hmm.
so much business about the architecture of the DC universe. And again, some of these events are feeding off of each other more than other. I don't know. It feels like kind of a lot, not all working together. And just kind of my question is like, what are we like? What is the point of this, or what are we getting from this? It just feels
Right.
like a bit much for me.
I think, in fairness, though, once you get past Metal, it's very much its own thing. I think it loses, except for like grand scope, but grand scope things have been going on, at least since the beginning of the modern age of comics. But the big bad of Metal is turns out to be the pet of the son of the big bad of the Justice League arc, and more or less death metal. You'll see when you get to it. I don't want to spoil anything, but yeah. But in and that of itself is like, it's kind of like, like a Dragon Ball Z thing. No, I'm the most. This is the most powerful I can be right now. but this is so much bigger. It's like, how big does it get, man? Just take it easy.
You know what's so funny as you're saying that? I agree completely. That's very much the feel of all of this. But going back to Power Rangers, that was Power Rangers. There was always,
Hmm.
Rita Repulsa is the big bad, but no, then it's Lord Zed, then it's the Machine Empire. There's always a bigger bad, and the Rangers always, no matter what level of power they attain, somehow they're still always able to level up. They get new powers, they get new costumes, they get new Zords. But I don't know. That
Hmm.
just that worked for me in a way in a way that I suppose this didn't.
Right.
I don't know. It's funny with we mentioned San Gregorio, and in particular, I've told the story about how he came into the comic shop years ago with the map of
Hmm.
the multiverse that Grant Morrison had designed, and he gave us all a lesson of the geography of it. uh, bless his heart, man. I really I love that he did that, and he cares so much about it. And I couldn't help but think of him early on in Metal when they meet Kendra Saunders, Lady Blackhawk,
Hmm.
and she busts out the map, the multiverse
Yeah.
map. Like as I'm reading it, I'm saying to myself, like Scott Snyder was like Mike San Gregorio in the comic shop with the map. And
Yeah.
now he has the opportunity to write a DC comic, and he's like, oh, I'm putting the map in there. And you know what? The map's not the whole thing. I'm going to have this character flip the damn thing over and say, there's
Hmm.
more. You see that blackness? That's the dark multiverse.
See, and that's what I was saying earlier about Stranger Things. That's directly from season one of Stranger Things when 11 takes the D&D map and
Yes.
just flips it over, goes this. So, a little derivative in that respect. That I kind of went off about that on my show. I'm like, no, 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 no. I like Stranger Things too much for people to be riffing on that so soon.
Yeah, it was a part of me for looking down at my phone, but I was just double checking the release date. Yeah, Stranger Things season 1 was July 2016. So,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
a good year plus before this. Yeah, what the
Mhm.
hell? Now I'm even angrier about this story.
But it all comes back around because the entire fourth season of Stranger Things is about metal. So,
Yeah, I suppose fair enough. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess the idea of this dark multiverse. So it's like we have our multiverse of 52, which I guess is meant to feel small, right? On top of it's like sitting on top of this vast dark ocean
yeah.
beneath it. There's also all of this talk about how the acolytes of Barbatos have been preparing Bruce to be the wagon, the
Hmm.
Wayne the wagon for the Dark God, the mantling as they call it, where he's been exposed to all of these heavy metals across Snyder's Batman stories in particular, with
Yeah.
between um, Court of Owls and Endgame and the various stories where he's been exposed to them, and then more in the prologue material to Metal, and then in I guess Metal number 2 itself, there's another metal that is created through Wayne Tower, right, or something along those lines, right?
Something. Yeah. Batmanium.
Yes. So because
That
he is
that
the
hurt my
vessel, right?
head.
He's the
Yeah.
chosen one, right? He's going to be this vessel for the Dark God to enter our world, and once the mantling is completed, we have the arrival of these other characters. I mean, most of Metal is we have the various teams that break up. We have Aquaman and Deathstroke. We have Wonder Woman and Hawkgirl. We have the group that goes to Thanagar Prime. Refresh my memory there. It's Hal, right? Hal and
Yeah, I forget. I'm sorry. I,
we
I
to,
forget by now.
totally fine. But yeah, so we have our various teams that split up, and then Clark himself going into the dark multiverse, and
Mhm.
uh, I mean that carries us through most of the
Yeah.
way.
How Mr. Terrific and the Plastic Man Egg.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We got there.
Mhm.
So that kind of carries us most of the way. And you mentioned the Batman who laughs, right? So we talked about these dark nights, these inversions. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess we already talked about this, but the idea that they're all versions of Bruce Wayne as opposed to just kind of versions of our character, like the rest of the characters, like they're just all
Right.
different versions of Bruce Wayne. I don't know. I guess if you're a huge Batman fan, this part's probably really cool.
It's pretty. I mean, probably make some really cool looking action figures, and who knows? I don't know. I mean, it's a gimmick. It's a gimmick that puts '90s to shame. It's fun. but there's not a lot to it. A lot of them don't have much personality. I mean, like probably Dawnbreaker, the Green Lantern analog, has the most personality because he's a coward, but that is just derivative of Power Ring from the New 52 version of the Crime Syndicate. So I don't know. I don't. The only one I really cared about was Devastator, just because he was the Superman esque themed one. And the
Right,
fact that
right.
he wiped out his whole planet by accidentally infecting the whole planet with the Doomsday virus was pretty insane.
Yeah, it's funny because just kind of reading, past social media posts or Reddit threads here and there. Just I was trying to get a sense of what people kind of feel about this. And one thing that came up, people did shout out the one shots that accompanied the main event. The only one other than really, so I really just focused on the Snyder written ones, but I did read the Batman Who Laughs, since this character got so much play, and I wanted to see the backstory there, so I did. I mean, again, I hate to say it, and I don't mean to keep being a downer, but after everything we read, like the idea of more, I was just like, nah, I'm good. I'm good. But I did read the Batman Who Laughs special. So we find out the Bruce Wayne of Earth negative 22, right? He's exposed to this Joker toxin when Joker dies, right? That's
Mhm.
only activated upon his death. And it's this slow acting toxin, so it takes a little while to fully take effect. But essentially, Batman's highly ordered mind remains in effect. So it's not the chaos of the Joker. His ordered mind is still there, but the moral compass is gone.
Mhm.
And it is an effective scene where he calls in the rest of the Bat family, and they're like hatching plans to try to save him and everything, and he's like, no, and he just wipes them out,
Yeah.
right? And it's a chilling scene, and then he becomes the Batman Who Laughs. Again, and I think you said this a little while ago, and this kind of seemed to be a prevailing opinion online, that the character quickly came to suffer from overexposure.
Yes. In the 2 years that he was around, he was in a lot, and once you get toward probably the last quarter of that Justice League run, the build up to death metal is I forget what it's called. It's where the Batman Who Laughs goes around corrupting other heroes on Earth Zero, and it's just. And then he gets his own miniseries, and it's just a lot. He was like Wolverine in the 90s. You just could not get away from him, and is that burned me out really quick. Plus, I just don't understand how he sees through the ring of spikes on his over his eyes. I'm like, that's a neat design. It works probably really well in like a Spawn comic or something, but it just I'm like, no, looks
Yeah,
cool, but it's not functional at all. It's completely not Batman like because it's not functional.
fair enough. I guess overexposure aside, I mean that's not a huge thing for me because I've not
Mm,
read everything, so but
yeah.
I get what people are saying. I guess to me it's just I don't know what maybe it's just my own limitations. I'm not grasping something. Like I don't know what the Batman Who Laughs really says about Batman, or what sort of journey it takes Batman on necessarily, that we haven't already seen some version of before, I guess.
Right. I think it's just a way of like, if you're a Batman fan, it's telling you that every argument you've ever had online about how Batman could beat any other superhero is right canonically. And I think that's what's annoying about it.
You're right. You're right. That even though I didn't read all of those one shots that gives you the
Mhm.
backstory of the Dark Knights, is that basically the gist?
Yeah. I mean that's the Devastator, because people always, it's like Batman versus Superman. Well, Superman could hover in space and cut off his arm with his heat vision. Yep, that happens in the comic, but Batman wins anyway. Okay, sure, man.
I've quoted this line before and we've talked about it, and I know a lot of fans don't like it. But in Batman v Superman, when Clark says, "If I wanted it, you'd be dead already." To
Mhm.
me, I'm like, if there were ever a statement that summed up the dynamic between
Yes,
these two, it's
that is
like you
true.
can bend over backwards to account for how Batman could win, but it's like, come
Mhm.
on, come on.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's funny. I wonder. Again, I would be curious for anyone listening. It's a Superman podcast, so I'm assuming most of the people listening are like us and are huge. Look at us, as we're sitting here with our Superman symbol shirts on.
Shirts on, right, hats and and
I
all
mean,
that.
I guess there are people similarly aligned. I'd be curious if there's anyone out there who's like, yeah, listen to the podcast, I like it, but really, I love Batman. If I'd be curious to hear from you because I think that's an interesting aspect of all of this, where we're coming at this. Yeah, we're open minded, and we you know
Yeah,
we're here to kind of take in the story as it is. But at the same time, we are still looking at it through the lens of Superman. So
right.
that colors things. But kind of on that note, from and then we'll get into the Justice League because I know that's more interesting for you
Mhm.
especially. But Superman in metal, what little there is. I mean, I guess what stands out to you? What do you see as any quote unquote arc, if we can even call it that, or moments in that story?
Metal begins the theme, and it focuses very strongly on Superman, that it subverts a trope in DC Comics. Superman will always win because his heart is pure and he's full of hope. And we've seen canonically that the universe likes Superman. We've seen it back in the '90s with Kismet. The universe thinks of Superman as its champion, and the universe will bend towards Superman. We in this The whole arc from metal through death metal completely subverts that, saying no, the universe in and of itself is a Hobbesian, you know short, brutal, and cruel place. And you can believe in yourself all you want, and you can charge in with like the light brigade at the last second. You can come in like Gandalf, coming over the rise, and you very well might fail. We see that when he and Barry and John Henry break the barrier so that Superman can go to the dark multiverse, and he's like, I'm coming, Bruce, I'm coming, Bruce, I'm coming, here I am, I made it, oh crap, it's a trap. And we see that over and over and over, and especially, I don't want to spoil anything, but that's a big part of like the next sub arc of Justice League past where we stopped here. um, we see it in the Justice League comic, where it's like, where Batman says, where he's fighting Luthor, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit. It's like, this isn't too big for me. I can absolutely win because my heart's in the right place and I believe in myself. And then Luthor breaks all his limbs and teleports him away. It's setting up that the universe does not bend to the whim of the good guys just because they're the good guys. And that focuses very strongly on Superman for good reason.
Hmm, interesting. Yeah, I mean that idea, I think is worthy of exploration. I mean, it's funny, and again, I think I'll have a clearer sense of this when I get to the end of this event because next week is Doomsday Clock, then the week after we'll do Death Metal. But again, Doomsday Clock is all about, or at least by the end, it's a Superman story, right? It's all
Mm-hmm.
about Superman. It begins with the child in the rocket, right? Like
Right.
everything starts from there, everything forms around that idea. So again, to have kind of a different take on it is fair. I think there's some validity to that, even if
Yeah.
it's not necessarily what I gravitate toward the most, but fair enough. I will say what I liked in terms of characterization. I did like I liked the Clark Bruce dynamic. It's fine. I mean, there's the one instance where Bruce has stolen the nth metal from Black Hawk Island, and Clark grabs what he thinks is Bruce, but it's of course it turns out to be Clayface. But Clark says he's like we're Bruce, like we're brothers, like just let me help you.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that. I
Yeah.
thought that was cool. So in terms of the characterization, I thought that was cool. Uh, when we ultimately get to the point where Clark and Bruce are reunited in the Dark Multiverse, and they are aided by Sandman, Neil
Mm-hmm.
Gaiman's Sandman of all characters, who pops up here with Neil Gaiman's permission. Let me
Right.
also say this. I think this is important because we talk about how Snyder's playing off on the Morrison ideas, and it was how the appropriateness of that. Morrison seems to be totally on board with this, and was one of the co-writers on the Wild Hunt special, and
Right.
you talked about metal in interviews and talked about how it's Scott's story, but so it was the sort of thing where Snyder seemed to have Morrison's blessing, for whatever that's worth to people. When we talked about Final Crisis, I brought up this idea. This was before I read any of metal, and I said my ignorant fear without having read it, was that Snyder was going to be playing with with Morrison's toys, but without all of the tools, so to speak. And I said, I hope to be proven wrong. I don't say this to be mean. I feel like my fear was founded. And as I'm reading this, I say to myself, okay, again, it has a lot of those Morrison-esque ideas and some of the ticks and all of that. But it, again, and I don't know, maybe I already said this earlier, but the soulless, that's the way a lot of this felt to me. It just kind of felt soulless. So, it is what it is. But,
Yeah.
but going back to the Superman of it all, when Clark and Bruce reunite and they're aided by Sandman, and eventually they make their way to the World Forge,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they need that pure metal to help raise the multiverse. But if the spark is totally gone, they're out of luck, right? And there they find Carter Hall, Hawkman, who has been transformed into the new dragon of the
Mm-hmm.
Forge, what Barbatos used to be before he took out the Master Forger. Jesus Christ. As I'm saying this, I'm like, shut up. This is what I was not looking forward to about this episode. I'm like, God damn it. I'm
It's a lot.
sorry. It's a lot. But they're it seems like all hope is lost, but they're talking to this dragon version of Carter Hall, and I guess Bruce's strategy is to try to get a rise out of him in some way. It's like, yeah,
Mhm.
Carter Hall is dead. Carter Hall, and that awakens something. And as Clark and Bruce are sinking, down, it seems like maybe there's something left there, and that
Mhm.
proves to be the case when in the subsequent issue Wonder Woman ventures downward and lifts them up with the 10th metal and all of that. But I don't know. Other than that, I didn't feel like there was really. It's not a failing of the story. It's not necessarily a Superman story, but that kind of felt like it's kind of the gist of the Superman piece of this.
Yeah, and Superman is very tangential in this whole story. He's more of a mm, almost a MacGuffin. It's like, you're gonna have Superman do this thing for the sake of. It's almost like, I would, instead of MacGuffin, Superman is Kyle Rayner's girlfriend. It's like Superman almost gets fridged in this to further Batman's arc.
But on that note, okay, so also let me say, even though I really, really had a hard time with this reading, I'm enjoying this conversation and I'm finding this very therapeutic. So I thank you, and I thank the audience, and I appreciate you bearing with me as I'm sorting out my feelings and frustrations on all of this. But when we talk about Batman's arc, does he have one? I mean, like, this is the thing that I think I'm also having a problem with, where it's one thing that it's this Batman themed cosmic event, but once Batman's taken to the multiverse,
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like then it becomes more about the other teams tracking down the nth metal. Like, I don't feel like there's as clear a through line, even with Batman, throughout all of
Right.
this.
Yeah, when I misspoke and referred to Superman as Becca, Batman is the MacGuffin of this story. You have to have, you've got to get the Batman in the place to do the thing with all the metals at the right time to make the thing happen. So, like, and there's even a point where the heroes are looking for Batman, like one would look for a MacGuffin in a story. It's actually, I hadn't thought of the Morrison connection until you brought this up, and that actually makes me feel worse about this story. But I'm going
Oh,
to suggest something that might make you feel a little better about it. And I mentioned this on my show. I don't see it as, now that you pointed out, I see the connection to Morrison, but I see it more of a thematically similar to what Jeff Johns was doing in JSA, which I know you're a huge fan of. Because remember, in JSA, after Hawkman came back, everything got connected to Hawkman. Hawkman was like the focus of the universe. He brings in Kendra, who I love. I love Kendra in this JSA. So we're bringing the first time Kendra has really come back since New 52. And then we had the Carter Hall connection, and then with all this stuff of Carter Hall doing the investigation, and he's one of the four tribes. And remember, like in JSA, it's like, well, you had, Carter Hall, and then there's some connection to Hank Hall, who's Hawk, who impregnated Don Granger, who gives birth to a baby that turns into the reincarnation of Hawkman's son Hector Hall, who becomes Dr. Fate, who was Nabu, who was Prince Khufu's advisor back in ancient Egypt. So everything was Hawkman centric in JSA, and I feel there's an element of that in here. It's like really bending over backwards to make connections that don't really work, but I do kind of appreciate the effort at the same time. I've thought a lot about that JSA run.
No, that's a good point. And
Oh,
that's
and
a
plus
yeah.
Daniel, plus Sandman is Hawkman's grandson. That version of, remember, Morpheus is dead. This version of Sandman is Hector Hall and Lita Trevor's son, who was raised in the Dreaming.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that went over my
Right.
head. But okay.
Yeah, Daniel Hall.
No, that's fair. And so I don't know. I have to ask myself that question. Yeah, why I love that JSA run and what was done with
Mhm.
Hawkman there. Why does that work for me where maybe this doesn't? I feel like maybe part of it is that it's been done. I
Right.
think that's part of it. And I feel like also with that JSA run, there was business to be cleaned up with Hawkman,
Mhm.
right? Whereas I guess maybe I feel like with some of this, we're like I said before, like drawing these lines that really don't don't need to be drawn. Whereas in the past, again, there was so much that needed to be sorted out with Hawkman that it felt like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, like this is helping to make sense of all of this. Whereas this just
Yes.
felt unnecessary.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
maybe that's where I land on it.
Yeah. Johns's JSA is much more organic, and he drew his own lines, and Snyder's is taking lines that are already drawn and kind of tying them together in maybe a way that doesn't really work if you think about it too hard, but if you're just along for the ride, and the bombastity of it is still fun from
Yeah,
my perspective.
no, 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 for sure, for sure. Even within the context of two Jeff Johns works, I feel differently about Green Lantern Rebirth than I do Flash Rebirth. Right? I love Green
Mhm.
Lantern Rebirth because I felt like there again. There was business to be done there. There were I don't even want to say wrongs to be righted because I actually quite like Hal's journey across the '90s from Parallax to Spectre and all of that, even like as
Mhm.
controversial as it was at the time. But all that being said, within the context of Hal Jordan as a Green Lantern, there was fixing to be done. So I felt
Right.
like I feel like Green Lantern Rebirth had more of a mandate and it had more to do, and I think it did it well. Then when we get to Flash Rebirth, which I just reread when we did Flashpoint, it was fine, but I felt like there too, all of the retcon about Barry's mom and the creation of the negative Speed Force and all this other business, it felt not entirely I had a similar feeling, not quite as
Mhm.
strongly, but I had a similar feeling with Flash Rebirth as I did with this, where it just felt like okay, what are we doing here? But it is what it is. Well, actually, let me ask you because since you've been covering it on your show and you've reread it multiple times, Metal. I I don't know. Is there anything, especially on this last reread, any feeling of yours that's changed? Any new insight you've gleaned? Anything where you've been like, oh, I really look at that in a different way now? Just curious.
I think kind of the Hawkman connection is what I really noticed the most, which is really just the most tangential part of it, since Hawkman isn't really part of the story, and you know it's used as a vehicle to give Hawkman his own series that Venditti's going to do some interesting stuff with. I I like that the best about it, and it's what I noticed the most when I was dissecting it for my show. Beyond that, though, it's like trying to do a different kind of swimming stroke in really shallow water. There's not much to it other than the fact that it's fun. It's not particularly deep. It's not really insightful, but it's like metal music, which I love, but you know, some metal is just, hey, let's play really loud, let's play really fast. Let's sometimes, like with power metal, let's talk about dragons and wizards in a way that doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't always have a lot of social context, which we get a lot of in, I think, when you get into the Justice League arc. But metal's just there to be loud and ridiculous and silly, but in a good way if you're not trying to attribute any kind of real meaning to it.
Two last questions on metal, and
Okay,
then I promise we'll
sure.
get to Justice League. Since you've been covering it, I'm just curious. If you've heard anything from your audience, or if you've gotten any kind of consensus from your audience about like how they feel about metal, and if it
Oh
lines
no,
up with what we've been talking
my
about.
audience doesn't give me any feedback.
No,
Like the 20 people that listen to my show don't really give me a lot of feedback.
fair
I
enough.
wish.
Well, I mean, well, that leads me to my next question, because I know you have a large, do you have a very large X following? I'm never going to get used to that. But I think I saw an old tweet of yours where, I think it was yours. One of the things that I will do sometimes before an episode is I will search for whatever we're going to be talking about, and then I filter it
Mhm.
for people I follow, just to sort of get a sense of what folks, especially when we're looking back, right? I'm like, curious,
Mhm.
what were people saying at the time? And I think it was one of yours where you said, this the, the question of like, is this satire? Is this meant to be satire? Because it's like so
Yeah.
over the top. Was that you? Yeah.
Yeah, that was me. Yeah. And Snyder himself actually said, yes, but it's, along the lines of like, yes, it's satire, but it's also from a place of love.
Yeah.
Because I think I said it, and then somebody else responded to it and tagged Snyder in it, which I never recommend doing. And then Snyder like caught that, and he's like, "Yeah, it's satire, but it's also a love letter."
I can't imagine Scott Snyder would ever listen to this, but on the off chance he does, again, I'll reiterate what I said before. Like, right on. Like, I'm glad you told your
Mhm.
story, and I respect it. And again, I'm open to revisiting it down the line. Just at this point in time, yeah, I just don't think it was for me necessarily. The last thing, and this is not Snyder specific, but just kind of where we are in the DC timeline, the DC continuity, the era
Mhm.
that we're in, because now we get into this weird stretch, right? Again, last time we talked about Flashpoint, which led to the new 52. And then we talked about Flashpoint Beyond, but that's kind of its own thing anyway. But in this rebirth era, we're still, until we get to Doomsday Clock and the fixing of the timeline, where Alan Scott is able to grab that lantern and the JSA rises and Clark can become Superboy and everything's right again. We'll talk about that
Mhm.
next week. But uh, we're still at this point where it's ostensibly the new 52 timeline, but we're in the rebirth publishing initiative and
Right.
elements are coming back and all that. But it's this kind of weird mix. And I guess I feel a little out of sorts at various places. Like
Mhm.
when the Justice League encounters Lady Blackhawk, aka Kendra Saunders, they don't know who she is. She says, "You don't know me.
Right. Yeah.
I'm Kendra Saunders," and it's like, oh, okay. So again, totally different than my sound like an old man, but like my JSA, my knowledge
Exactly.
of this character. But even within this story, she starts off like, "You don't know me." I don't know to the extent they even know Hawkman. But then later on, Diana is talking to her like, "Kendra, like we're your friends," and there seems to be this
Yeah.
lived-in familiarity there that doesn't seem to track. It was hard to. I kept bumping up against that. It's like, where are we here?
That's something I've addressed over and over and over on my show, is that with the beginning of Rebirth, it's like more and more elements of the pre-Flashpoint continuity are bleeding in, and there's no clear demarcation where they are. And I don't know how much of it is intentional, like where they're trying to show that the continuities are slowly emerging and they're eventually going to get smushed back together, or if it's just editorial oversight. I honestly don't know what to make of it. I like the Rebirth era because it's what got me into Superman. Rebirth is a freaking mess, all of it, and it wants so bad to go back to the way things were before Flashpoint, and they don't know how to do it organically. And it's it's a tangled mess of continuity. So I don't have an answer to that other than just yes. Yeah, yes, they shouldn't know who Kendra is, and she knows they don't know who they are, but sometimes they act like they do.
I feel like, I know this is kind of tangential to metal, but I feel like if I had my way, the Rebirth special, whether it was in the special itself or if we had gotten, if it had been a mini series or something like that, if we could have gotten the mechanical work that Doomsday Clock would later give us, if we
Mhm.
had gotten that then, right? Because the Rebirth special, Wally West reemerges, right? And he talks
Mhm.
about how there's this unseen force that stole 10 years from us. And it wasn't just the years. He stole the love, right? Clark and Lois aren't together. Ollie and Dinah aren't together, and on and on. And I feel like if that had been quote unquote fixed at that point, I
Hmm.
feel like, but again, I like you said, I guess they didn't like they wanted so badly to have it fixed, but why guys wanted to take their time with it, wanted to build to this doomsday clock event. I get, but yeah, then it creates this kind of gray zone for these few years here before
Yeah.
you get to that point. So, that, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a tough thing. Oh, the one other bit of business when we talk about connecting these lines, and not that this even bothered me per se, but we have the man who laughs, right? The Batman who laughs. He has his own agenda here, right?
Hmm.
So it's for him. He takes the the astral brain of the Anti Monitor, right?
Hmm.
The reconstituted form of the Monitor, the original
Hmm.
Monitor, and his own dark matter energy. So this combination of antimatter, positive matter, and
Hmm.
dark matter, and wants to use that to just wipe out everything, bring
Hmm.
everything into the darkness. So, again, it's just another instance of kind of taking all of these trends. And I know I keep saying this the last thing about metal, and clearly it's not. So I'm going to stop saying that. But the metal itself, right? So it's this forge in the dark multiverse from which all of the other Earths and universes and multiverses were created. This metal, I guess, in its purest form at the forge is its most powerful. And then the various metals that we see in the DC universe are kind of removed or diluted versions or something like that, right? Where we have nth metal. And again, basically any artifact, any item within the DC universe, whether it's, like, again, Steel's armor or Diana's bracelets or Naboo's helmet, like
Yeah.
whatever it is, like there's this shared DNA to some extent,
Yeah.
right?
I don't like that. That feels like treading too much on other people's toys that they are currently playing with. It's one. I don't remember Steel's armor ever being made of nth metal. I am
Same.
not as well versed as Steel as you probably are. Like that came out of nowhere. Plastic Man being made out of kind of had it sort of made out of nth metal, and it feels almost disrespectful to the writers who are doing stuff with those characters in their own direction. Is like, yeah, I don't remember who was, maybe it was Rekka who was still writing Wonder Woman at that point. It's like, oh yeah, that character you're writing, her bracelets are nth metal because I say so. I'm like, no, that doesn't really work for me.
It's funny with Steel. I think I owe you a tweet response because I think you asked about Steel's missing hand in 52.
Yeah.
I don't know. I definitely have gaps. I never read Steel's solo series, and then
Yeah.
I read certainly when Mark Schultz was playing with him in the Man of Steel series, around
Mhm.
our worlds at war time and all of that. But then there's, I guess, the end of that and beyond where I have some spots in my Steel knowledge. We'll be
Right.
getting there.
The closest I can come to that is during the big superhero supervillain battle towards the end of Infinite Crisis. The general chomps down on his hand and breaks it. So maybe the logical conclusion is he eventually had to have that hand amputated. I don't know,
I
but I don't.
suspect.
I don't. I've searched online. I've tried skimming through every appearance of Steel between the Schultz run and 52. I couldn't find it, but yeah.
That
Thanks.
is
I'm glad you don't know either because that makes me feel like I didn't miss something.
there's just so much when we're talking about this 85-year mythology. It's funny. I think
Hmm.
about this all the time. Anything we cover on this podcast, anything, there are people out there who don't know what we're talking about, and we're we're filling them in, and then there are people who are experts on it, right? Like anything we talk about, because there's just so much, and everyone has their own thing, so it's all good. But I think this is a good segue to Justice League and just kind of this idea, right, of all the metals connected and everything. And this is a very fine line in comics. And I think that this idea of connecting dots, drawing lines, whatever you want to call it, I feel like writers really need to tread very carefully because there's something to be said about the role of chance in all of these stories. I always go back to that Brooklyn Nine-Nine quote from Captain Holt. Everything happens for a reason, and that reason is random chance. And I feel like there's something to be said for that. And that's why I always have a hard time with stories like what Bendis did with Rogol Zar. This
Yeah.
idea that no, there was a guy who destroyed Krypton. It's like, no, no, no.
Mm-hmm.
There's a mythic aspect that we're losing here. Even, look, I'm wearing the Blur shirt, my beloved Smallville. The season 3 episode Relic revealed that Jor-El had gone on walkabout on Earth years earlier, and he had this
Right.
love affair with one of Lana's ancestors. And it's not just that later Jor-El would choose Earth or even America or the Midwest or Kansas or Smallville. No, no, no. He specifically chose the Kents because
Right.
Jonathan's ancestors made a really positive impression. And I love that show to death. But I'm like, no, no, that's way too far. There needs to be some aspect of we don't know if he's going to make it. We don't know where he's going. There's got to be some chance. There's got to be some mystery. And I feel like the more we kind of retread these, these origin, whatever story we're talking about, but especially the origin ones, I get there are only so many things you can do with them. So always looking for new angles. Okay, what can we explore this time? But I feel like there
Right.
is a line, and I feel like we cross those lines with stories like that, and I don't care for it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the same way I feel about um like Burns' Man of Steel, where Jor-El specifically chose the Midwest of the United States because in Reagan's 1980s, that's the best place to bring up a young man. Like, no, man, I don't like that. I like the randomness of it. I like the fact that Krypton exploded because of the ego of the Kryptonians, and I kind of like the whole thing from the Burn era, where the Clone Wars from centuries ago and all this other crap. You know, I like that. I don't like that there was a guy you can punch who destroyed Krypton. I don't like that. I like the randomness of him landing on Earth, and that's why you get all these cool stories like Red Sun about the what if, the randomness swung a different way. Um, I forget where I'm going with this, so I'll turn it back over to you.
No, no, no. But that's and I'll use one rare Marvel example. But I was a huge fan of the Amazing Spider-Man run when J. Michael Straczynski took over in the early
Mhm.
2000s, and
Same.
his first arc introduced the character Ezekiel and the
Hmm.
idea that it wasn't random that Peter was bitten by that spider, that he's part of the spider totem, and it's why so
Hmm.
many of his villains are animal themed. And I thought,
Right.
oh, as an idea, as a theory, as a hypothesis, that's kind of cool. As
Right.
the run went on and it became, no, this is actually what it is, I felt like, no, it's cool as this notion that's floated to him that he
It
can
works
sort of
better as
wonder
an
about.
as a it works better as an indie work, as a creator owned thing, where you have your creator owned animal totem superhero. That works. But yeah, I agree. It doesn't work for Spider-Man. I'm not a huge Spider-Man fan, but I do like that run.
Yeah. So, all right, and I know we kind of only have glossed over No Justice. I'm happy to go back to that, but the Snyder Justice League run, because from our earliest conversations about covering this, that has been what you gravitated towards.
Mhm.
We took a look at those first 18 issues. So, let me toss the ball to you. So, what is it about this run that resonates with you so much?
Okay. There's two main things about it. Other than, well, three. One of them is Hot Girl. I love the portrayal of Hot Girl in this run. She is the star of this entire run for me, which is really smart. It's like, again, the Morrison comparison during their JLA run, Martian Manhunter got to play a huge role in every arc because he didn't have his own book. Hot Girl doesn't have her own book. He gets to do all kinds of things with Hot Girl that are really fun and really neat. And even though Clark is kind of what I want to aspire to, Hot Girl's attitude is kind of more what I relate to. Like if there's an evil clown that comes at me with a chainsaw and I find the guy who's responsible and I have a mace in my hand, there's a better than average chance that somebody's getting a mace swung at their head. I also like old weapons, but that aside, that's just fun and neat. The deeper reason that I like it, one, um, there, and I think John Stewart gets a lot of this when, as part of this story, for the listeners who haven't read it, um, Sinestro come taps into like this ultraviolet spectrum, like the invisible spectrum, and it's what feeds off of your inner self-doubt, your inner self-loathing. And the more you try to bury it and the more you try to cover it up, the more it grabs a hold of you. And Jon Stewart is prime for this because of the destruction of Xanshi in Cosmic Odyssey from like 1989, which is a really great story. Um, and Jon is able to overcome the ultraviolet spectrum, and he's able to help the world overcome it by owning it. He doesn't embrace it. He doesn't lean into it, which is another theme of this arc. It's a big theme of this arc is leaning into your worst qualities, but he owns it. He's like, yes, I did this, and I do have some self-loathing because of it, but I'm not going to deny that I did this thing that was stupid, that hurt a lot of people. Because, like you said, Snyder's open about his mental health problems. He's got depression, and um, you know, getting past these things that you don't like about yourself or mistakes that you've done in the past, the best way to get past it is to own it. Yes, I did this thing. I can't cover it up. I'm not going to gloss over it. I acknowledge that I did this thing, and by acknowledging that you did it and acknowledging that you're a human who makes mistakes is the best way to get past it. That is really powerful, and I love that part of that's what really hooked me on this whole arc. It didn't have anything to do with Superman up until probably the first like micro arc of what you're going to read for the follow up. That's really great. The second part is, and I didn't know if I was imagining this or reading into it or not. So I read a lot of reviews, and a lot of people seem to agree with me. Snyder refuses to say one way or the other, from what unless I've missed something. But a lot of people, um, well, should we talk about what the overall? I guess we ought to talk about what the overall theme of this is,
Sure.
right? Now, you kind of mentioned it, where Luthor has this epiphany in the end of No Justice that he originally thinks of it as entropy, that the universe leads toward entropy, and that's what makes him give up his heroic face turn, and he leans into that. And so there's a lot of this of Luthor leaning into the worst qualities of humanity and saying, this is your natural state. If you have these thoughts and these thoughts are attractive to you, you shouldn't lean away from them. You should embrace the worst qualities of yourself, because this is the natural state of the universe. And it's his whole mission is to kind of to get others to embrace that. And a lot of people have compared this to the Trump presidency. I don't think it's supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be an analogy of the Trump candidacy, the run up to the president, where Trump, and I think it's maybe more of an analogy to Trumpism than Trump himself. The idea of, if you have these ideations that other people are going to look down on you for because they're selfish or they're hateful or they're cowardly, you should embrace them anyway. You should embrace the worst qualities of yourself if those are what you gravitate toward. You should stop trying to become a person with more integrity. You should stop trying to be a more ethical person, because that is not your natural state. And Luthor thinks of himself as the hero in this story. He thinks of the Justice League as the actual villains because he sees them as trying to steer the universe away from its natural state. I find that fascinating. And I didn't realize that was the case until the last issue of this run. And I'm not always the sharpest tack in the box. Sometimes very obvious things I will gloss over them because I'm like, hey, look, Superman in shiny colors. But the last issue of this run before Death Metal starts, I'm like, oh, I get it. And like I said, I don't want to spoil anything. I know you haven't read it. I know if any of your listeners haven't read it yet, I don't want to spoil it for them either. But it really, really becomes apparent at the very, very end of the arc. And the throughout the series, you see the heroes um, marshaling themselves for victory, and it's completely subverts the trope of, okay, the odds are against us, but we are on the side of good, and we have the willpower, and we have the hope, and all the good parts of the lantern spectrum, basically. And because of that, we can win. And over and over and over, the series goes, no, that is not necessarily the case. Just because you believe in yourself and because you are doing the right thing does not mean that you are going to win. And that is, if not, I mean, it kind of subverts everything that's about Superman, but it's still really, really fascinating to me. It's a really interesting read.
That is. No, no, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate your passion for it. And yeah, I mean, we'll see as I make my way through the second half of the run. Hopefully all of that lands and I come away with a deeper appreciation for all of it. But that idea, it is an interesting one. And it comes up in what we read where I think Martian Manhunter says it at some point where this whole idea again, and we'll get to the Justice Doom War in the later
Mhm.
part of the run and all of that, but what the universe bends toward, right? And whether we're kind of thinking Lex and entropy and all of that, or even just the whole justice versus doom. And
Mhm.
Jean says something along the lines of like, well, what if it bends towards doom, and we're actually the villains of the story,
Right.
right? Which is an interesting idea, right? Because they, of course, feel they have this mandate and they're pursuing the good, and
Mhm.
it's kind of an automatic. And then to get these not even necessarily answers, but even just the posing of the question, right? Now that they've again at the end of Metal inadvertently shattered the source wall and they've let
Yeah.
loose all of these forces, right? And all of these things are coming to light and it's calling into question again everything that they've been working toward. It is interesting, of course. Batman's response, I think it's at that point. Batman's response to Jean's question is, "We justice harder."
Mhm.
I'll just leave
Mm.
that there for people to
Right.
do with what they will. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, the whole Luther of it all. I know. So when we look at kind of the structure of the Justice League run, so Scott Snyder is the lead writer, but James Tynion writes a bunch of the Legion of Doom centric issues, and
Mhm.
we hit a few of them in what we read for this, and you see Luther's recruiting efforts, right? So I definitely can see what you're saying. It's interesting because we definitely talked about the comparisons between Luther and Trump when we looked at the President Lex arc from the
Mhm.
Loeb Kelly era. A very different flavor though, right? Because that was a Lex whose public front, on paper actually was, you could understand why the population of the DC universe might
Yeah.
might fall in line. The frustration for Superman and for the readers came from, oh no, we know how he really is. But in
Mhm.
terms of what he was putting forth, it wasn't necessarily playing into, people's, the worst in people, right? So
Right.
this definitely has a different feel to it. So, I get what you're saying on that front. The Yeah, again, I know I laid out kind of the big tent poles of this a little while ago, but once the source wall is broken, right, we have these Omega Titans who are awakened, and essentially they've planted seeds, right, representing mystery, wonder,
Uh,
entropy,
and wisdom.
and wisdom, right, on
Right.
all of these worlds, and then they come back later to see which energy is most dominant on that planet, and whichever one it is, that's the Titan who consumes that world.
Yes.
And so they've set their sights on Brainiac's homeworld, and he recruits the Justice League, and eventually they set their sights on Earth. And I mean, long story short, the heroes are able to essentially trick three of the Titans into consuming the fourth one, right?
Mhm.
And that sort of saves the day at that point. But the larger threat remains that the source wall is broken. You've got the Green Lantern Corps, issue after issue. They're just standing there, like pointing
Right.
their rings at it, trying to contain it. But these forces, these energies have been released, including these seven forces
Mhm.
that include what you were referencing before, this invisible spectrum. There's also the still force, which the Flash villain, the Turtle, had
Mhm.
tapped into, and others as well. And unlocking or mastering those seven forces is the key to the totality, this uh, massive energy source that
Mhm.
emerged from the wall and made its way to Earth, and that Lex has a fragment of in the form of a doorknob.
Right.
And we'll later learn that totality houses Perpetua, who again was the originator of the previous multiverse before she was imprisoned behind the source wall. I
Mhm.
think as we're talking about all of this, right? dark multiverse. We just got a multiverse not that long ago. We just got
Right.
the 52, the 52 worlds of the multiverse and Morrison's multiversity, which mapped everything out and gave you all these worlds. But now we get this dark multiverse. We get these Omega Titans, but there's still a larger thread in terms of the totality, and we need these seven forces, and then it's Perpetua. And I can only imagine what's still to come in what I haven't read yet. And I think that
So much.
so much. I mean, look, I said this to you off mic, and I hate to say it, but it's just like I'm kind of dreading. I'm looking forward to the recording for Death Metal
Hmm.
in 2 weeks, but I'm really like kind of dreading the reading assignment. But I'll get through it. But I think the problem I'm having is that any one of those things, right, could have been interesting to me, but I just quickly saw the pattern that no matter what we were looking at, oh, there's something else right behind it.
Yeah.
And when you look at when you look at kind of the long view of the DC universe, yeah, that's always the case, right? There's always a bigger bad. We get that.
Hmm.
But they're spaced out. It's like
Right.
when you compress them all into this, it just got to the point where I stopped caring because
Hmm.
nothing nothing felt like it really mattered because you knew that there was just going to be something else,
Right.
kind of right behind it. So that was kind of the larger problem. And so over that first arc, the totality, we have a couple of the leaguers inside the totality trying to take control, being protected at a microscopic level by fellow members, yet infiltrated by microscopic versions of Lex and Joker. So we have that
Uh-huh.
business going on, while we have others contending with some of these other forces. The next big arc I know really gets into Drowned Earth, which I will admit I largely skipped.
Yeah.
I didn't
I
have it in
do
me.
not like that arc. I just don't. The closest I've ever come to caring about Aquaman was like the first 12 issues of the Peter David run back in 1994. Beyond that, I just cannot care about Aquaman. And I know there's some really hardcore Aquaman fans out there, and I'm like, great, good job. The Sub Diego run was pretty neat too, but I just don't have it in me. I'm sorry.
Aquaman's kind of tough. I mean, I read the New 52 Jeff Johns run a few years
Hmm.
ago for a Patreon episode, and I really actually quite liked it. And I
Yeah.
liked the first movie, and we'll see what this next movie is like.
Right.
But I mean, that's about it. Not a character I really have a lot of affinity for, and I don't know whether it's the Obsidian Age and the Joe Kelly run on JLA back in the day, or I
Hmm.
just like these Aquaman centric events really don't do much
Yeah.
for me. But in the final arc that we looked at, we get all of this business about this previously unknown, even to them, shared history between John Jones and Lex Luthor,
Yes.
or Luthor. And you've gone
Hmm.
back and forth between Luthor and Luthor over the course of our conversation. I had an audience member who reached out and took me to task because I don't say Luthor. I watched 10 Years of Smallville. It was Luthor.
Yeah.
Lois and Clark was Luthor. I mean, I don't know. But it's,
I think
everyone
it's
has.
I think it's like the childhood Super Friends fan in me that will always say Luthor.
Yeah, no, look, there's definitely precedent for it, no doubt. It's it's all good either way. But in
In
my
my head,
mind,
I
it's
sound
always
like
Luthor.
Ned Beatty going, "Mr. Luthor," but it is what it is.
But we get this. And I think this is why this run was always on my radar because when I did my Lex centric event a couple of years ago, I knew this was out there. Where we get this backstory with Lionel Luthor as part of this Legionnaires Club, this science cult. We get, and again, this previously unknown interaction, friendship between young Lex Luthor and Martian Manhunter. How do you feel about this? I mean, we
I
can talk about what it is, but just
Yeah.
kind of big picture. How do you feel about it?
I didn't have a problem with it. I actually thought the thing with Lionel was interesting because it took the different versions of Lionel we've gotten across the media, and we get, he's kind of similar to the Lionel from Smallville, where he's got the long hair and the beard, and he's really smart. And I watched Smallville. I was not as into it as you were, but I definitely watched the whole thing. I don't remember if he was a scientist or not. But then it somehow managed to take that and say, okay, here's how we went from that version of Lionel to the abusive drunk that we got from like the post crisis to infinite crisis era of Superman comics and flashbacks. So I thought that was pretty neat. I didn't have a strong opinion either way about the young John Jones and young Albie, as he called himself. LB, which meant Luthor 2, Albie. I'm like, okay, that was a stretch. But I mean, it didn't bother me, but it didn't like excite me either way. It was like, oh, this well written story. It was kind of sweet, but beyond that, it was either way, I was a good.
Yeah, the Lionel of it was fine, I suppose. I agree with you because we had obviously the TV show, right? So cemented what we kind of think of with the character, and then in terms of the comics, when John, well, I guess I mean before that, Birthright, had
Hmm.
had Lionel there, and but it was so fleeting. But Secret Origin by Jeff Johns like really went back to that, alcoholic, abusive mode. And I mean, the Lionel of Smallville was abusive, but just in a in a different
Right.
way, and was this accomplished business leader and all that stuff. So yeah, I agree with you. This kind of reconciled that, so that was fine. But this whole idea, and I guess this stems from in our text thread today with the guys. I was trying to explain this to them. It sounded ridiculous. I was like, they're part of this secret cult, right? Where I guess the idea is that as the totality from the source wall is making its way to Earth, it's like falling through time. So it's being seen across eras as it's falling to Earth, right? And so you have people across history studying it.
Yeah.
And Vandal Savage in particular is dialed into this, but Lionel and this science cult are kind of like off doing their own thing. And I think the other idea was that in the previous version of the multiverse, uh, Martian and human DNA were sort of one, and then in this new version they were split, and that's why the science cult was so keen on
Yeah.
studying
So,
Martian DNA.
something like that. Yeah. Yeah, that was the thing that really didn't resonate with me is the whole Vandal Savage of it. Because, Vandal Savage is probably one of, like, in terms of humans on Earth in the DC continuity, one of the most despicable beings alive, right? And so he starts out, he becomes immortal, and he's become the champion of humanity, and then he finds out through the observing the totality what humanity's original function is, which you'll get into more of in the latter half of this coverage. And then every horrible thing he's done has been to save the planet, to move the planet out of orbit so that the totality doesn't land on Earth. And that, I'm like, no, man, you can't take every awful thing that Vandal Savage has done, including allying himself with the Nazis, to say it was part of my grand plan to save Earth. I'm like, mm-mm, nope, I can't jive with that.
Yeah, no, that's
That's a
fair.
reach. Yeah.
That's fair. That's fair. I think the whole Albie thing. First of all, it's like, why was it meant to be a surprise? I mean, clearly it was going to be Lex, little red haired
Yeah.
kid. But anyway,
Yeah.
uh, I think two. I have two problems. Number one is Lex has a secret past with Clark. We don't
Hmm.
need we don't need to add others.
Right.
Maybe this is a Superman fan of me being protective, but it felt like they were forging this connection between Lex and John. And not that I dislike that dynamic. I think it could be
Mhm.
interesting, but I didn't need this added bit of history. And the other problem that I have ties back to what we were saying a few minutes ago, where the implication from that story is that Jean being transported to Earth as a youth is what made him brought back again when he was like, it wasn't that
Yeah.
random accident that teleported him to Earth years later. He had been
Yeah.
marked, so to speak.
Mhm.
And again, like we talked about before, I think that just kind of it robs his story, his origin of something important. So again, drawing that connection point between those two characters in that way, I don't know, I really didn't care for it.
Yeah. I like I said, I didn't. I'm completely neutral on that. It didn't bother me one way or the other. I do like what Snyder does with Martian Manhunter and Hot Girl, where it's obvious from what we've read so far that they're developing an emotional connection, beginning with where she is shrunk down and in the little craft inside his body and fighting the Joker and all that, and building up to the stuff on Thanagar Prime. I thought the Thanagar Prime stuff was pretty fun too. But most of the characters who shine in this are characters who don't have their own books. I don't think Jon Stewart was. I think if he was in anything, he was like a tangential character in Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern Corps. Hot Girl hadn't been anything for years. Martian Manhunter, at the most, he gets like a miniseries now and then. So it's, he's taking these characters who don't have other writers working on them, and he's doing stuff with them. Like you said, this thing with Lex and Martian Manhunter might be unnecessary, but it's interesting at least.
Sure, sure. I think that's all I got, man. I don't know. What is there? What else do you want to talk about with this? I mean, I'm happy to keep going, but I
Right.
think I don't know. What else that we haven't talked about did you want to?
There's so much I can't say about about specific things of this run in general I like because you haven't read it yet, and I don't want to spoil it for you. Um, but all I can say is if you hated, well, okay, so I want to back up first. Like I was saying earlier, you know, in death metal, you have like, okay, you have to have this element plus this element plus this element plus this element to do this thing. Metal plus metal plus metal plus metal equals Batman the Portal. And then in No Justice, it's like this cosmic giant plus this tree plus this cosmic giant plus this tree equals, eventually comes to this. And that honestly, No Justice feels kind of pointless until you get to that Justice League annual where they're trying to fix the source wall and you see, oh, the whole point of the source uh, Omega Titans is they're meant to patch the source wall, and by the Justice League killing one of them, it messed up the whole ability to fix the source wall. And I think that's another interesting thing about this. It's the Justice League constantly fixing a problem in the present moment, which leads to bigger problems.
Just like DC.
Yeah, exactly. There's a an urban fantasy series I used to read a lot of called the Harry Dresden series, and that was a big thing of that. It's like, okay, I've saved my girlfriend from being killed by vampires, but I've started this huge war between wizards and vampires, and it's like I fixed this problem, but because I don't see the bigger picture, I'm creating other problems, and they lean a lot into that, especially on Thanagar Prime's. Like, look, you Earth people are idiots. You don't understand galactic politics, and because you're fixing these relatively small problems, you're breaking the universe. And like even breaking the source wall, that wasn't part of a plan. It's not like we have to break the source wall to stop Barbatos. We stopped Barbatos, and in the process, we screwed up and broke the source wall. That's an interesting theme. Um, but the Justice League run, it does that same thing. It's like, okay, you have to have this thing plus this thing plus this thing plus this thing to do the larger thing. It's like you have to have the still force is what enables the ultraviolet force to do its thing. And then once the ultraviolet force does this thing, you can do this thing with the sea gods from other planets and all this other crap. But because it is more spaced out and there is room to breathe between them, it didn't feel overwhelming like like Metal and No Justice did. So I give it a lot of credit for that. It's got a lot of moving parts, but there is space between the parts and there is more space for character development. But I can say, if you hated the part about taking the anti-monitor's brain and doing this thing with it and doing that, you are going to hate death metal with an absolute passion because it gets so much worse.
I would really never use the word hate on Mike,
You're going to
especially.
really dislike it.
But yeah, I think it'll be a rough time. It's
Yeah,
it's funny whenever whatever we're talking about in an ideal scenario, right? Uh, it's great to be able to be positive, right? I love that,
yeah.
and it's fun, and even within that, right? Anything we're talking about, always things you like, you don't like, but overall, to have read something you enjoyed and to be talking about it is always a
Mhm.
great place to be. There are things like the Flash movie where I didn't really mind ripping into it so much because I felt like Warner Brothers deserved it for all of
Yeah.
the hyperbole they engaged in the marketing, and so I felt like, yeah, this is fair game. But generally, it's like I don't relish that, and I don't like kind of sitting in that space and in that energy. I don't enjoy it. So to come on and do an episode like this, like it breaks my heart.
Right.
But I really I don't want to be hyperbolic now, but when I think about all of the things I've read for the podcast, this is kind of this is kind of up there as far as like what I really, really had a hard time with. I mean, the example that I always use as something I really disliked was Superman Year One by Frank Miller and
Mhm.
John Romita Jr. But
Oh,
that was
oh,
3 issues and out. So even
yeah.
though I really didn't like it and I feel like it totally missed the mark, it was fine. But this, this really just kind of came to be a slog after a while. So I don't have high
One
hopes
thing
for
you
Death Metal.
one thing you will probably like about the second half of this Justice League run is that Tynion does take over a lot of the writing duties. I even think of this as the Snyder slash Tynion run
Okay.
as a whole. And he leans more into character development. It does tend to slow down in a good way. And like you said, he writes a lot of the Legion of Doom stuff. He ends up taking over some of the Justice League stuff. And I think it's because Snyder said, "Well, I've got to go write death metal, so here you take over this part." And it's really smooth. In my opinion, I think Tiny and stuff is smoother than Snyder stuff. I
Okay.
really like Tiny and as a writer, regardless. But yeah, that's the only. I went out of my way to read his Batman run just because I like Tiny and I'm not a huge Batman fan.
All right, right on, right on. Hopefully that will will work in my favor. I want to give a shout out to a couple listeners who, because I put the call out. My original plan was to do death metal next, but I was again looking, double checking the publishing history for Doomsday Clock and death metal, and I put the call out, and a few people were like, no, 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 Doomsday Clock then death metal, and I
Yeah.
appreciate that because I think if I had to turn around and do death metal right now, it would be a very unhappy host. So thank you guys. I guess I do have one last thing with the JLA, this Justice League run in particular, the breaking of the source wall.
Mhm.
I think this goes hand in hand with some of the kind of fundamental philosophical problems I have with all of this. And we talked about undermining the importance of random chance in these
Mhm.
stories. Similarly, I look at the source wall, and it's one of those things where it's this mystery of the DC universe, and I get that you tell
Mhm.
enough of these stories, and eventually someone's going to be like, well, we have to see what's behind that. I
Right.
get it, but at the same time, part of me feels like, is it worth it? Are we losing more than we're gaining by sort of taking
Right.
away that mystery? Look, the DC animated universe, it took Lex behind there at the but it was the series finale. It was the very end,
Mhm.
and even then, you still didn't really know what it was that he got
Right.
back there, right? So I think that's the other thing I sort of struggle with, where we're making these connections where maybe they don't need to be, and we're solving these mysteries that maybe work better as mysteries. There's something
Mhm.
powerful about that that's being undermined to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get that. And like I was saying earlier about the breaking of the source wall, by the time, and this goes for both metal and death metal, by the time I get to the last issue, I'm skimming. I'm like, okay, lots. It's a lot. It's a lot. Scan, 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 scan. And like the first time I read Metal, I didn't realize the source wall had been broken until I read No Justice. I'm like, wait, when did this happen? Oh, it happened. They reference it in one panel of the denouement of issue 6 before it gets to the epilogue. And it's like, and they kept going, and the source wall broke. It doesn't show it. Like when the source wall breaks, it needs to be like a double page splash. It needs to be the biggest thing that's ever happened in DC continuity, and it's not even really shown in the comic where it happens. You don't really see the broken source wall until issue 1 of Justice League. You're told about it in No Justice. Well, no, actually, I don't remember, but that's where I most remember it, probably because of like the Jim Chung art and the Jorge Jimenez art. But like you don't see this big thing that happened. It's again, you're told, you're not shown, and that felt like a real letdown. And again, when you get to death metal, you're going to see what I'm talking about. By the time you get to the end of it, you're like, I'm not really sure what happened, because by then I was just I wasn't going panel to panel. I was going page to page and just like, okay, are we done?
All right, audience, pray for your host when I get there. But on the note of the art, Jimenez and Chung and Manipul on No Justice and Capullo, I really
Mhm.
enjoy the art across the board. I know
Yeah,
we didn't really focus more on the writing side, but I really very much enjoy the art, and that was an enjoyable aspect of all of
yeah,
this. But
yes,
li-
absolutely.
But listen, thank you very much. And again, audience, if you love metal, that's great. And if there's anything you think I'm missing that might be the key to unlocking my enjoyment of it, please feel free to reach out. I would love to be able to say, oh no, I get it now. But right now, this is kind of where I am. But Grant, I really appreciate your insight and being able to bounce ideas off of you and have this conversation. So I thank you
I
for doing the
appreciate you having
homework. I
me.
thank you for coming on. And what would you like to tell people about your podcast and where they can follow you and all that good stuff?
Sure. My podcast is Truth, Justice, and Hope, a Superman podcast. Like Anthony said, right now, and since the beginning of the show, it's been largely focused on rebirth. I started with Convergence in 2015. I'm about halfway through death metal on the show right now. Eventually, I'll be moving on to the Bendis era, which is going to hurt, but I'll do it. And you can find me wherever podcasts are found. You can find me on both Blue Sky now, which I really like, and the app formerly known as Twitter by searching either at About Superman or just searching for Truth, Justice, and Hope.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone will check out your show and follow you on social media. You mentioned Convergence. We'll touch on that at some point in one of these last episodes, but I did not have it in me to do a whole episode on it. So if
Oh
anyone
no,
was wondering, that's why.
Convergence is a hot myth. The tie-ins are the good part of Convergence. Convergence itself is just nonsense in a not good way.
Gotcha. If I had, I mean, I'd save this for off mic, but I feel like if I had known about metal, I probably would have just done metal and death metal in one episode and have just been done with it. but it's fine. We take our time, and it is important to be doing this Justice League run because I think you're totally right. I think it's those two, the metal events bookend really the heart of the story. So I'm glad that we're doing all of it, and we would need 2 episodes, so it's all good. All right. Thank you, Grant. Thank you, audience. Make sure you come back in 1 week for chapter 11 of Red Skies. We will be getting into Doomsday Clock by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank. Don't miss it. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.